A guten Erev Shabbos. When we come across this week's portion of Vayeshev, Joseph and his brothers, it touches on the darkest moments in our memories of sibling rivalry. It's a normal part of growing up, and yet the story here in Bereshis, in Genesis, takes things to their extreme. Joseph, as a youth, is clearly their father's favorite. He doesn't hesitate to tell his brothers about his grandiose dreams with the images of his own superiority in the family. It awakens in the brothers such a resentment that they're not even able to speak with their brother in a civil manner. Lo yachlu dabro l'shalom, the Torah says. But wait, it gets worse. The brothers plot to murder their despised sibling, God forbid, and in the last moment they relent and decide to sell him into slavery. If you don't recall the story, I'm going to spoil it for you now. Joseph is taken into Egypt, he's sold as a slave, and eventually rises to become Pharaoh's second in command when he's brought in as a dream interpretation consultant. There's a famine in Egypt that brings a famine in Israel that brings the brothers to Egypt. And unbeknownst to them, they bow down before their brother Joseph, whom they don't recognize, and who is now the viceroy of all Egypt. The very end of Genesis, Joseph declines to take any measure of revenge against his brothers and told them that although they intended the plan for ill, God turned it into something good. So let's take a quick peek at 3 commentaries on this incident and see what they reveal, not about the story so much, not about the characters, but about the commentators themselves and what they might be able to teach us across the centuries. First, Rashbam, Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir, born in France in 1085. He was Rashi's grandson. His mother was Yocheved, one of Rashi's daughters. Rashbam looks at the story and explains that the brothers discussed among themselves the idea of selling their brother Joseph, but as they were talking, a caravan of Midianites passed by and heard Joseph crying out from the pit. They were the ones, those Midianites, who took Joseph out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelim on their way to Egypt. That's how he wound up being sold as a slave to Potiphar. Rashbam reasons like this. What's the point of having the Midianites mentioned in the story at all? It's because they were the ones who took Joseph, sold him off to the caravan. It's entirely possible, he says, that the brothers didn't even know Joseph was being sold. Says Rashbam, there's that moment decades later in Egypt when Joseph says, that you sold me. He means the brothers brought about the situation that took Joseph into Egypt and into slavery, not that they actually did it. Another early commentator, Rabbeinu Bachya ben Asher, lived in the 12 and 1300s in Spain, in Saragossa to be exact. He's of the same opinion of Rashbam, that it was actually the Midianites who sold Joseph as a slave. Although the brothers did not know it was happening, they certainly thought about the notion of human trafficking. They considered it, and they actually brought about the circumstances where it could happen. So Rabbeinu Bachya doesn't consider them to be off the hook, completely without sin. Now, fast forward 500 years to Germany, where Rabbi Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg was the Rav of Königsberg, which is now called Kaliningrad. He served there for 34 years till he passed away in 1865. In his commentary on Chumash, his sefer called Haksav VaKabbalah, Rabbi Mecklenburg finesses the verses that describe the conversations among the brothers as suggesting all they wanted was to break his ego, not, God forbid, to put his life in jeopardy. The brothers wanted Joseph to feel humbled a little bit, broken, not quite so arrogant, so as to lord it over the rest of them. Rabbi Mecklenburg explains the unfolding of events like this. The brothers were waiting for the Ishmaelites, who they thought would be coming from one direction, and the Midianites arrived first, coming from the other direction. The brothers didn't sell Joseph, but in effect, they caused him to be sold. The brothers thought that if Joseph went with the Ishmaelites, who were desert people, he would stay in the desert, wouldn't be found. But if he were sold to merchants who would likely traffic him to Egypt, that would be a place where a lot of people come and go, and their deed would probably be discovered. It's a little bit of a complicated rationale, but there it is. Others agree, including Rav Hirsch from Germany, the Malbim from Russia. So here's the thing. These commentators on the Torah, spanning almost 1,000 years, go to great lengths to exonerate the Bnei Yisrael, the sons of Israel, from the unthinkable, unconscionable act of selling their brother into slavery. Now, for the most part, we accept that that sale is exactly what happened. That driven by jealousy, envy, anger, a real mix of emotions, these brothers turned on one of their own, and they did, in fact, sell their brother off as a slave. It broke their father's heart, as we see later in the Parsha. So to what extent did they factor that into their rather rash actions? The assumption of much of Jewish literature that this is pretty much as it happened. To this day, there are Purim plays called Mechiras Yosef, Selling of Joseph, and Rabbi Sachs's book called Not in God's Name, which we read recently, traces all the sibling rivalries through the book of Genesis, and he shows how forgiveness, reconciliation, and moving on, as we ultimately see with Joseph and the other brothers, that's the ultimate goal of humankind. And yet, these couple of rabbis whom we mentioned here were not having it. They could not accept, they simply could not countenance that brothers, Jews, were capable of such atrocities, one against the other. They went to great lengths. They found new readings. They finessed other standard interpretations. They pushed the envelope of commentary tradition to exonerate, to let off the hook the other brothers for selling Joseph. Let's keep their efforts in mind as we go forward from this week. In the past couple of years, we've seen some pretty unusual upheaval in the Jewish world. If it were only our adversaries, we would say, Dayenu, it's already enough. The onslaught of murder at the beginning of the war, the atrocities, keeping hostages living and dead for more than 2 years. Can we ever forgive the Red Cross for abandoning their most basic calling here? But that's not the main point. To go through what we as a nation and as a people went through was awful enough. Remember that for the 8 or 10 months before October 7th, we were fighting with each other. It was nonviolent, but it was fighting. It started in Israel, it spread to North America and the diaspora. We were taking sides. We were saying it was the end of the state, the end of the people, if it didn't go our way, whatever that was. Does anyone remember if they really meant what they said? Or did they allow the rhetoric to get out of hand? Obviously, evidently, those feelings were not representative of the deepest truth, because the moment the war broke out in Israel and the Jewish people came together, we came together as one. For one brief shining moment, we stayed together. We supported each other. We grieved together. We buried the dead together. We comforted the bereaved together. And we resolved to stay together for the future. It did not last long. Before long, we were back to our old ways of fighting amongst ourselves, and that long-standing tradition continues today in Israel, in North America, around the Jewish world. People are fighting with each other, taking sides. We're supposed to resist the temptation to be like all the other nations. We're supposed to stay above all that and stick to our mission of being one holy people. But the temptations of digital media are great. To write an editorial calling out other Jews, what they're doing wrong, to send texts and WhatsApps criticizing other Jews, choose up sides in whatever political, economic, or social, cultural wars being fought at the moment, to give in to polarization and hostility and I can't talk to them, just like ever, just like Joseph's brothers did. This guy, we can't even look him in the face and have a conversation. How are we not facing that same challenge, that same problem? So let's take comfort and strength and resolve from those few scattered perspectives on this tragic Parsha. Even though we know in the end things worked out, still we're not allowed to rely on miracles. Let's see the good in other Jews, especially the ones we don't agree with, or we think are misguided or outright wrong. Let's not get outraged or incensed. Let's remember who we are, the children of Israel, Bnei Yisrael, and we have a higher calling than whatever the issue or the social media of the moment calls us to. We answer to a higher authority. Shabbat Shalom. This Shabbat in Shul, we will bless the new month of Teves, which begins next Shabbos. The Molad, the reappearance of the moon in Jerusalem, the eternal and undivided capital of Israel, will take place next Shabbos morning at 2:22 a.m. with 10 parts. Die Moilad wird sein dem kommenden Shabbos in der Früh, 22 Minuten nach 2 Zeger mit 10 Halokim. Rosh Chodesh will be next Shabbat and Sunday.